as much as I have. It's been a tremendous meeting, and I can't count a single talk I didn't enjoy. I mean, that really is very unusual for a cynical old fart like me. So this has been a great meeting. There are lots of things to say in general, but I want to start with the fundamentals, because to me this was a meeting about the importance of herbivores in secondary succession. Now, science works best when three things are done in concert in a way that influences one another. So we want theory, we want experiment, and we want observation. Now, this entire field is based on observation. The theory of succession is pathetic. Now, one of the reasons it's pathetic is it was developed by botanists. And if you're an ecologist, you know that botanists are not terribly good at theory. So the entire process was dominated by the effects of interspecific competition. So one species replaced another one because it was a better competitor at that time. And there were only really three marginally interesting things that were ever said about this. And they were said by two Americans called Connell and Slattier, that there were three kinds of things going on. The first one was the nothing's going on model, which is actually probably the most realistic most of the time. That is to say, all the species get to the place at the beginning of succession, and what you see first are the ones that grow fastest. So the annuals dominate at the beginning, and they're replaced by things that are growing a bit slower but end up taller than them, the perennial grasses. And they, in turn, are outcompeted by the tallest things, the trees, but the trees had been there since the beginning. It's just they were growing slower, so you didn't see them. So that was the nothing's happening model. Then there was one which was quite sexy called facilitation. So species B couldn't invade species A until species A had changed the environment so it now was deleterious for A, and B could outcompete it. So that was facilitation. And we saw some nice examples of facilitation in the talks. And the third and last one was the opposite of facilitation. It was called inhibition, where species B can't invade species A until species A has become debilitated. And the Dutch have done lots of really fascinating work on this, where, for example, marram grass gives way to festuca because the marram grass accumulates nematode herbivores on its root system with the passage of time. So that was basically it. It was a linear thing. It was based entirely on one trophic level. It was plant-plant interactions. And you got this thing at the end, the climax, if you like. Great name, isn't it? The stable ecosystem at the end, where interspecific competition was replaced by intraspecific competition. The species that became dominant was the one that could regenerate in its own shade. And that persisted basically forever. It's still the one that's in the textbooks. And of course, it's absolute nonsense. The competitive ability of plants, which this is all about, depends entirely on the suite of herbivores that are living on them. And the identity of the plants that dominate is determined by the mix of herbivores that are attacking that suite of plants that happen to be in the species pool. So, of course, herbivores mattered. They've always mattered, but the theory left them out because it was theory developed by botanists. So we need a decent theory. What would that theory have in it? Well, we've seen the elements that need to be in it from the talks, both today and yesterday. The theory has to have spatial heterogeneity in it. It has to have different kinds of areas important for species at different times of year, at different stages in their life cycle, and so on. So it has to have spatial heterogeneity in it. Can our theory of succession be deterministic? Does species B follow species A and species C follow species B? Of course not. It's got to be, in the jargon, stochastic. It's got to have a random element in it that's terribly important, which species get there in order to be selected from. Now, this is the issue. If you take old-fashioned models of competition that are just botanical, and you add to them spatial heterogeneity and stochasticity, you get models whose complexity of behavior is such that they're not actually helpful anymore, because they can do everything. Bob May famously showed that with just one parameter, the population growth rate, you can model any population dynamics. You can have exponential growth, you can have damped oscillations to a stable equilibrium, you can have cycles, you can have, famously, chaos with one parameter. Now, the model that I've just outlined to you would probably have at least 5 or 6 parameters in it. So that the sheer complexity of the model destroys the reason for having that sort of theory. And that's a big deal. So what we need is better theory. That's what I'm saying. What about experiments? My contention is that there are no experiments on rewilding. Now, that may be a bit extreme, but to qualify as an experiment, to me, something has to be replicated, and it has to be randomized. You have to have treatments and controls, and they have to have been given to those items in a randomized way. So I think we haven't got any experiments. So our theory's rubbish, we haven't got any experiments, but we've got some fantastic observations. The problem with observations is, because they're not backed by theory or experiment, they're open to myriad interpretations. And that's what happened with the problem that we got into with the traditionalists, with their model of succession based on the analysis of pollen. Now, I'm going to say something fairly extreme now, but I think palynology is not a science. I think it's a religion. It's a belief system. And it's a bizarre belief system, because it says all the important species in ecosystem function happen to be dispersed by wind, and to have preservable pollen, and to get into peat or into lake sediments. Why should the Keystone species be wind pollinated? There's no reason. Probably it isn't. I mean, in these nice Dutch examples, the Keystone species for the regeneration of quercus is a thorny rosaceous plant, like a hawthorn or a buckthorn. They don't end up in the pollen record. Why not? Because they've got insect pollinators. So these observational studies on which most of what we say are based are terribly flawed by inherent biases, by religious fervor in some cases, but by the lack of a decent interaction between theory and experiment. And what I was really heartened by was the compelling evidence that comes from groups that we don't traditionally think of as important in these studies. So we had mollusks, we had lichens, we had beetles, and they were all telling the same story. Herbivores matter. The conditions that herbivores create are absolutely essential to the dynamics that these systems require in order to persist. So that's what I, as an ecologist, have got from the meeting. Lots of other really fascinating stuff about making it work, about the politics, the sociology, the economics of it. Incredibly important. And I've learned a huge amount. But because I don't know anything about it, I'm not going to talk to you about what I've just learned. So I think, have you enjoyed it as much as I have? Yeah. I think because of that, we ought to express thanks particularly to Charlie and Izzy for hosting it. But their endeavors are as naught if it came to actually making it happen. And the person who really, above all others, there was a big team involved in making it happen, but the one person who I think deserves our utmost thanks is Maureen. Come out, Maureen. Here's a kiss. Well done. It really was fantastic. That's it. Thanks for coming.
Did his job fantastically well, but I have to say that the frogs were very, very well behaved as well. So I want to thank them so much, the speakers, for their time, for coming here, and for just sharing their knowledge with us. I think it was hugely inspiring. Thank you very, very much to all the speakers and to Mick. I wanted to say that we have a little gift for you over by the door there. Derek Gow is hiding them. They are bottles of gin from the Weald. So they're from the wild, and they contain, the sort of the herbage of the Weald. So that's and from a lovely little sustainable distillery down the road. So that's a gift for all of you to take away. It's got your names on it. And for those of you, I realised, who suddenly it came to me that you might have come by plane and can't carry gin in your hand luggage. We have got something slightly different. It's a thumbstick, a walking stick, made from wood from here, made by a lovely old guy called Mr. Wood, and believe it or not, his colleague who also makes sticks with him is called Mr. Leg. So together, when they sell things at fairs, they're called Wood and Leg. Maureen has gone to the trouble of ringing the airlines to make sure that these thumbsticks aren't a dangerous implement and you're not going to be stopped from boarding the plane. The thing is, they have to be used as a mobility aid. So if those of you who are taking a thumbstick with you, you've got to look like you're using it as you're going through security. And finally, just a huge thanks to you, the audience, for coming. I'm really, really appreciated, and thank you very much for being here.